Thank you, good morning, and can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks very much for inviting me. I did want to talk to you a bit about the work we've been doing at Tate Modern. I'm the Director of Regeneration and Community Partnerships. So I'm involved in the senior team and I'm involved in the curation and the management of the museum, but I'm also very much responsible for how we work externally, whether that's political or with business or with other cultural institutions, with artists and with communities. And that's very much part of the DNA of Tate Modern. I know it's a big museum, but I think there's some examples and obviously lots of commonalities with the rest of the museum sector. And I want to talk a little bit about that today. And a lot of people think of Tate Modern as a new museum, but actually we've 20 years into this project now. We just celebrated our 18th birthday and we took time to build it beforehand. And very much at the heart of what we've been doing since the start is what we call the social model of the museum. So we're very interested to be part of the city, part of the evolution of the city, partners in the city. We're not just a big tourist attraction that's dropped into the city. We are part of an evolving ecosystem and growing system. And that's very much then reaching out into our neighbourhood in South London. So as well as being a national museum and an international museum, we are a local museum. We are working in the context of some of the most diverse communities in the United Kingdom. I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'll just mention it briefly because this is a great example of art in the community. This is a street art exhibition we did. Now in South London we have a problem with young men getting involved in gangs, and it's quite a big issue. And when we put this work up, what do you think this young man's doing? Well, I had the gun control officer from the municipality on the phone to me the first morning saying, "You've just put a black man with a gun at one of the main entrances into our part of the city. What sort of message is that you're trying to give?" Now it's a video camera that the young man's holding, but of course it's supposed to fool us into believing that. But that's one of the little tensions of working in a diverse community and working with conceptual and contemporary art. Close to us is what the biggest Latin American community outside Spain in Europe. We have a huge West African community, lots of people from Eastern Europe. So migration is a constant factor in this part of London, and increasingly transnationalism, because people don't, in the old days people would go to the other side of the world obviously and stay. Now people are coming back and forward, there's economy, there's all much more sophisticated forms of migration. So we're in the middle of all of that, and like Emma's going to talk about Hackney in a moment, over 100 languages spoken in some schools in some different parts of the city. So we have adopted a philosophy which is very much about in the museum and outside the museum. We less and less see a wall, a visible wall between what we do in and outside. And we very much want to be a catalyst to bring people together. We want to be about partnerships, about dialogue, about exchange, and about community. And I think there's been a lot of change, obviously, in the world and in how we work in the last 20 years. London's a place of rapid change, so is Frankfurt, so are cities all over the world. The world is rapidly changing. Fake news, social media, AI, the fast pace of the life we live, the people moving about all over the globe. So I'm really interested, and we're interested in how we can find relevances for, not known for fast moving, really, the museum sector. So how do we continue to be relevant as museums in this sort of intense world that we're living in? And I think it's true to say we have, and we're seeing fundamental changes in our practice in the world and around some key principles. I think we're becoming much more social and equitable in how we run our institutions. We're blurring the lines between the expert and the public. the curator and the visitor. We're moving our engagement with visitors and communities from passive to active relationships, absolutely crucial, and very much more negotiating and involving our audience and community in the evolution and the practice of the museum. If you think about 20 years ago, you went to the doctor said, take these pills, you went home, took the pills. Now you say, why do I take these pills? I've looked it up on Google and it tells me it's got this side effect. Same in museums. Our audiences are expecting to come in and question and dialogue and be involved. So I think we're also becoming political arenas, explicitly and implicitly. There's a proposal in Britain at the moment to use museums as polling stations during the election, a way to interface with a community that's different. Community hubs, and as I said, more comfortable working inside and outside the building. I was going to say something else on there. Yeah, and sorry, two other things I just wanted to say about that. You'll hear about this today and during the conference, but I think in some of the best cases, Rotterdam and Berlin are two very good examples. We're actually going as far as making new social contracts with our communities and our citizens, which is a really exciting place for the museum to be and how we position ourselves in civic life and in society. And I mentioned about the polling stations. So one or two examples just to shoot through of projects Tate's been involved in these areas. Of course, we continue to look and draw on our historical and traditional collections, but using that to look at our cities afresh, our communities, reappraise diversity and migration, for instance. This is an exhibition we did about migration to Britain historically and looking at it through the prism of the collection in a different way. We're collecting much more globally now, whether that's locally or in our case, collecting global artists, and I think reflecting much more, in our case, of the 20th century world, its diversity, the cities and the movements. And in the time I've been at Tate Modern, when I came there in 2000, we had a very Northern European, US, male-based collection. When we opened the second phase of Tate Modern in 2016, we had more than half of the artists were women in the rehang, and we had work from all over the world. So in half a generation, in 16 years, we fundamentally changed our collection. And another thing I think we've seen is, this is the Guerrilla Girls. Now this is quite traditional. It started in the 70s or the 80s as a social movement about museums excluding women from their collections and from their work. That's part of the collection now. So that's fairly traditional. People who start outside of something as rebels in the end become absorbed into the collection in this case, or into the work of the museum. What we've been involved in is some projects where we're trying to look at that in reverse. So this is by an artist called Ahmet Ogun, who's Turkish, but he's based in Amsterdam. And he wanted to work with asylum seekers, people, highly educated asylum seekers, who are in a sort of form of limbo, in a form of status. And so he inverted the museum by creating this silent university where the asylum seekers, doctors, people with degrees, they became the lecturers and the academics, and the staff and the public became the students. And it was a whole series of events where the lectures were given, but not verbally, they were given in a form of sign and performance. So it was an interesting contemporary piece. It brought asylum seekers into the museum. It was a different approach for us. But what's happened is that happened for 6 months in Tate Modern. The Silent University has gone on. It is a real thing. It exists in a website. They're working all over the world. There was a big event in the Museum of the Ruhr near Essen 2 weeks ago. It continues. So it's the sort of reverse of the Guerrilla Girls. It's a social movement that started in a museum and has then gone out into society and taken on a life of its own. And I think that's a small but fairly fundamental change in the sort of practice that we're involved with. We've, a lot of you will have been to Tate Modern, I'm sure. In 2016, we completed the second phase of the museum. And that was trying to do a number of things, obviously increase the gallery space, give us different sorts of spaces, but it was very much about physically and philosophically connecting to the south of London. At the moment, the museum's right on the river. It's in a fairly now wealthy part of the city, but we wanted to move physically to the south, so creating an urban landscape and walkways to do that, but also the fact that the building radiates is actually quite symbolic of the identity and relationships we're trying to make. So right in the centre of this building, we've created something called Tate Exchange, which is an open space. It's a space we work in collaboration and evolution with a series of partners drawn from all over the country, and increasingly from the world. We're having partners from Germany, the Netherlands, Portugal, coming to work with us either remotely or in the building. And the premise is we come together in a sort of laboratory, in a series of partnerships to look at different issues. It's a rolling programme. People tend to come in for 2 or 3 weeks, have a series of workshops or displays, and then we move on. And you'll see on the list there, on the door, it's a huge number of associates that join us. And it's very much about, within reason, a free and negotiated space. So the museum is actually giving up the narration to the public in this sense, and doing it and giving over power in a different sort of way. An example, following on from the Silent University, of the sort of people we work with, this is Counterpoint Arts, who are a London-based arts organisation who specialise in working around issues of migration and asylum seekers. They work very much in a creative focus, specialist arts organisation, but they're involved with community centres, university, creative economy, and civic partners across Britain. It's not just a London-based project. So they've come in twice, and they explore with different partners all over the country some of the issues facing particularly asylum seekers and migrants through a creative process. This is around the flag and identity. This is a craft play on the Union Jack, but they're dealing with legal, political issues of identity, creativity and economy, working with all ages. They've just finished something with us, and this is a quote from one of the participants. And I think with this sort of work and the Silent University that I talked about before, it's quite important really to make this point that partnership is absolutely key here, and we have to understand the limits and the limitations of what we can do as a museum. So we have to work with specialists and experts in migration and asylum around these sort of projects. It's finding a way not purely to view people through the lens of that experience. It's looking at them as much more 360-degree individuals and looking at that experience in a rounded way rather than just focusing on the direct experience of asylum. Because, of course, that's A, incredibly sensitive, and B, if you came to England from Kosovo in 1989 or the Congo in 2000 or Syria in 2018, it's a completely different set of experiences. And we need to work with specialists to navigate, narrate, and be sensitive to those sort of experiences. And it's just incredibly, I found the experience of working with asylum seekers in particular, they are in limbo. They've got no money, so you need to think about resourcing and helping them with that experience. They're waiting for the letter or the phone call that means they can get an appointment to get themselves out of this stasis. There's a whole lot of layers around working with people in very extreme situations, as I'm sure you all know, but that's just an experience. So when we have artists now, and we do have them coming saying we want to work with a particular group of people in extremists like these sort of groups, this is very much the advice we have to give as the curators. It has to be done in a partnership and multi-layered approach. This is a good example of how this project links to creative economy. This is a Syrian refugee who came. He was involved in leather making. He worked with an artist in Derby in central England in helping put together artist purses and bags. But he's moved on to actually had all his own designs, and now he's working in a business with the artist, co-producing women's bags and purses. So has moved from this experience of the art project through to making a living. Just moving to art as a social project, which obviously is something we get a lot of. We are working increasingly with artists who are very much politically articulating through their work and wanting to work in and outside the museum. So this is Superflex, the Danish artist. This was a piece in response to the rise in anti-migrant feeling in Copenhagen. It was in a cultural space, but it was also in bill posters around the city. This is Jeremy Della at the Tate. This is a piece-by-piece recreation of, at the time, a protest camp against the Iraq War that was outside the Houses of Parliament in London, but it was a piece-by-piece remaking of it inside the museum. Suzanne Lacey, whose practice is very much about grooming groups of people, mainly women, together, and this is older women who'd been involved in political experience in Britain in the 60s and 70s, most notably with Greenham Common and the anti-nuclear movement, coming together to have a discourse, a dialogue as an art piece, but also to reflect on the legacy and the future of the society that their generation had been involved in. Ai Weiwei, Chinese artist, put 100 million ceramic sunflower seeds in the Turbine Hall, which I had to somehow manage. Part of that, very much a commentary on his relationship and the state's relationship with citizens in China. And then for us, an interesting issue, the collection itself becomes a focus of protest. So this is the opening of the new Tate Modern. This is a demonstration by a group campaigning for the artist Anya Mendieta. I think I pronounced that right, Mendieta. And she was her partner was Carl Andre, and there is an unsolved, but there is a strong accusation that he murdered her. And Carl Andre, they were in a relationship, and Carl Andre's work, the bricks and others, is in the Tate. So the collection itself is not neutral. It's not somehow, of course, existing in the past. And with the Me Too and all of the other movements we're seeing across the world, we are also the target, both explicitly with the collection and also with how we work as an organisation. So we've been the focus of protest ourselves. This is about some of our contract workers being on 0 hours contract, which isn't the best pay regime for a lot of people. The museum was high profile enough for a national campaign to focus on us. And one of the big dilemmas that we face as museums is who we take money for. Public funding is being reduced. We take sponsorship. In our case, until recently, we took money from the oil companies, from BP, and people very strongly, as you'll see, protested against that. So, as well as being a place to talk about and think about social protest, we're actually at this core of it ourselves as institutions, explicitly being used for political purpose. This is the last speech that Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister of Great Britain, did before he retired, and he chose the Central Hall of the museum as the place to give his final speech, sort of showing the power of culture and creative economy in the administration that he had governed. Through to the last election, this is an English artist called Bob and Roberta Smith, who formed the Art Party. It didn't get very many votes, but it was campaigning in the general election, an artist taking on a political party to put forward the argument for art, but again, using the museum as his launchpad. And finally, in this section, the fusion of it all, really, the synergy between all of these things that I've been talking about: art, society, politics, active behaviour by the audience. So here's an example. This was in 2003. This is the Turbine Hall in Tate Modern, which is the huge central hall that each year we give over to an artist's commission. This was Oliver Eliasson, the Weather Project. Some of you may have come to it. 3 million people came to visit this, which is more than shopping at the time, which is one of my great visitor figures. But within a day of that opening, you could see the ceiling was mirrored, so you could have a reflection onto the floor. Within 3 days of that opening, George W. Bush at the time came to visit London, and the public spelled out this on the floor. You know, it was an organised thing. But they appropriated the art almost immediately. This is not what Oliver... He wanted people to interact, but he didn't have political context. So almost immediately you see this, and we saw variations of this throughout the work. But the resonances of that have continued long after the work has gone. These are totally independent. This is university lecturers protesting about cuts in university, but chose to come in the hall and form their own sort of, their own homage to the works that had come into the hall. This is students protesting against student cuts. So you see the sort of resonance of the work, and the forum of the museum as protest has continued years after that original work. This is Tanya Bruguera. It's a contemporary art piece called Caitlin's Whisper, involving real policemen on real horses. That's an art event. This is a protest event in the same space. This is the anti-oil demonstrators bringing a sculptural wind turbine blade into the museum in ceremony with an accession number and presenting it to the collection as a form of protest against our involvement with the art piece. But you may well understand the audience has some difficulty dividing between art piece, protest piece. This is again the oil protesters, but making a sculptural and curated intervention and demonstration against the museum. This was obviously against the oil. And we moved from that to the Situationists, but again it's about how the public appropriate our space in museums. So this is an annual gathering. I don't know why, but every year about 1,000 men dress up as Santa Claus and wander about London drinking increasing amounts of alcohol and then go into places. So we had 1,000 Santas lying in the middle of the museum as part of their annual outing. So quite ephemeral, but actually fairly interesting that they would come into a museum and appropriate it in that way. So to finish, I just wanted to focus on 2 recent projects we've been involved in. And my team particularly, we curated the recent Turbine Hall installation. I don't know if any of you came to London to see it. It again was with Superflex, and the reason my department curated it, because we wanted to really symbolise a lot of the things we're talking about, but also this breaking inside and outside of the museum. So it was an orange line that ran throughout the work. It involved a giant pendulum in the Turbine Hall, but the main focus of it was a series of swings, 3-seater swings you can see all across the Turbine Hall. And the idea of this, one of the ideas was that when you go to swing or you go to a play park, you often do it with yourself or with someone that you're with. It's often 2 people. But with the 3-seater swings, there's a sort of encouragement to get together with strangers and work and come together in a collective action of swinging. So it's quite a simple idea. It's fun. It's something that people came together to do, but it had a sort of serious point, and it had this architectonic and this physical line that took you throughout the museum. This is the Pendulum in the Turbine Hall. It was a bit about a bit what I talked about at the start. The carpet and the pendulum was a bit about the enormity of the everyday world and us as individuals within it, coming into the second zone, which was about coming together to swing and to take part in a collective action. But it was also about having fun. And the main thing you heard in this exhibit, which again has attracted 3 million people over 6 months, was the sound of laughter, which I don't think is a bad thing in a museum when you hear people laughing and whooping and screaming. Children of all ages, by the way. And then it broke out of the building, so the line went from the museum, breaks out onto the southern landscape and down into the community beyond, with the swings, extending this idea. So it's very much about using the physical space, about our connections between the museum and the community. And the last one is, now this is a community project, and also this is the most people we ever had in the Turbine Hall in 20 years at one time, and it's a community event. And basically, for the reopening of the museum, we brought together 500 people from community choirs all across London. That was a gay choir, there was a homeless choir, there was a Latin American choir, there was a migrant choir, a refugee choir, from all over, came together with a contemporary artist who had made a musical piece based on oral testimonies of people who had either worked on the building of the museum or who were visitors who worked there and created this piece. We worked with a conductor and with the artist and with this disparate group of people all across London and brought them together for this opening event, as I say, hugely attended with... Now, what was I going to say? So I've got a short film just to show you of the end of part of that presentation. But that was an incredibly powerful thing, I think, and sort of catalysed everything I've tried to talk about, which is that sort of mixture of what a museum can do, in our case, creating high-class contemporary art, working with communities, working with the top artists, and using the museum as a social space. So I'll show you a minute of that, because that says it a lot better than I can. There it is. Yeah. You got a bridge, like wobbles. You got a bridge, like wobbles. And you step onto a new view. It's all.
They are singing with a single voice, which is really key. It's not about multiple parts. It's about this single, almost like a wall of sound. It is about that group experience, not just for the audience, but also for the performers as well.
So it's great. I love it when she goes, "It's all for us" at the end, like that. So I think that's all I wanted to really say. I think that social interaction, community partnership, dialogue have been and always will be central to what we do. But also I think it's partly our time in the museum world for this, and the power we can show politically and socially and to our communities lies on these sort of intimate developing relationships with our publics. Thanks very much.